Since the colonization of the Americas, a huge number of indigenous languages have disappeared, and of the remaining ones, most are endangered. But one language that has been remarkably resilient is Guarani, also known by its endonym. Guarani is not just an official language of Paraguay alongside Spanish, but it's also spoken by the majority of the population there, including a large number of non-indigenous people. Varieties of Guarani are spoken by smaller communities in the neighboring countries of Bolivia, Argentina, and Brazil. Guarani is a member of the Tupi-Guarani branch of the Tupian language family. It's more precisely a group of closely related languages, some of which form a dialect continuum with each other. But some varieties have low mutual intelligibility. The most widely spoken variety is Paraguayan Guarani, which has an estimated 6 to 7 million speakers. Proto-Tupian, the language from which all Tupian languages developed, is thought to have been spoken in the Madeira River basin in the Brazilian region of Rondônia, near the Bolivian border. Migrations from this region brought Tupian to various parts of South America where it began to diverge into different languages, including Guarani. Not much is known about Guarani before Spanish and Portuguese colonists began to arrive in the 16th century, because it was not a written language. The first people to document and describe it were Jesuit missionaries. Spanish colonists established the city of Asunción in the year 1537, but because of its isolated location and lack of natural resources, few Spanish people migrated there after it was initially established. The Spanish settlers were almost all men who married indigenous Guarani women. Their children, who became the elites in the following generations, were bilingual in Guarani and Spanish, which secured a place for Guarani in Paraguayan society. If the Spanish had set up a full administration there and a bigger Spanish population had been brought over, the Spanish language would have likely dominated, and Guarani would be limited to a rural indigenous minority, as happened with indigenous languages elsewhere in Latin America. The fact that they didn't see Asunción as very important and neglected it probably helped Guarani to survive as a majority language. Jesuit missionaries also helped the language survive. They built Jesuit missions known as reductions, a type of settlement for indigenous Guarani people that operated autonomously from Spanish colonialist rule. Of course, their goal was colonialist in the sense that they wanted to convert Guarani people to Catholicism and a European way of life, but they used the Guarani language in their efforts, and they developed a system of writing the language. They also created a standardized form of the language, and compiled Guarani dictionaries, grammars, and textbooks. Later, when Spain forced the Jesuit missionaries to leave, monolingual Guarani speakers from the missions migrated throughout the country, including to the cities. After Paraguay gained its independence from Spain in 1811, the country's first dictator used Guarani as a nationalist rallying cry, and he also prohibited the small number of Spanish colonials from marrying each other, which essentially resulted in forced race mixing and more bilingualism. Subsequent governments not only reversed that coercive policy, but they also repressed the Guarani language and banned it in schools, though governments used Guarani to inspire nationalistic pride in times of war, of course. How convenient. By the middle of the 20th century, populist politicians began speaking of Guarani more favorably to appeal to the Guarani-speaking majority. In 1967, it was made a national language, though Spanish remained the only official language, and in 1992, Guarani was made an official language alongside Spanish. According to the 2012 census results, 46.3% of households used both Guarani and Spanish, and 34% used only Guarani. That means over 80% of Paraguayans speak Guarani. The majority of Guarani speakers use a form of the language called Jopa, that involves heavy code switching with Spanish. The word Jopa means mixture. Unlike the simple integration of Spanish loanwords, referred to as Jopa refers to actual code switching or code mixing that includes elements of Spanish grammar. The form of Guarani used in schools is not Jopa, but a more traditional and literary form of the language. Let's take a look at some of the features of Guarani. The orthography of Guarani is based on the Latin orthography used for Spanish, with a few extra characters that represent Guarani sounds that don't appear in Spanish. All syllables consist of a vowel or a consonant plus a vowel. No syllables end in consonants, at least for native Guarani words. For example,
Maitei,
meaning hello,
Baeshapa,
meaning how are you, and this is often used as a greeting instead of Maitei,
Ipona,
meaning fine or good.
Hande,
And you?
Ipona Abei.
I'm fine too. Guarani has 6 pairs of vowels, 6 oral vowels plus their nasal equivalents. All voiced stops and the one affricate are prenasalized. They only occur before oral vowels. Their allophones are the nasal consonants, which occur before nasal vowels. Replacing an oral consonant with a nasal consonant to match adjacent nasal sounds is an important feature of Guarani. Guarani has nasal harmony. If there's a stressed nasal vowel or a nasal consonant, its nasality spreads to adjacent parts of the word. This happens with certain prefixes, for example. One such prefix is the first-person plural inclusive subject pronoun prefix, ja, which comes before an oral verb stem. Before a nasal verb stem, it becomes nya. So there's
Japuka.
meaning we laugh or we laughed. And there's
Ñañe'e.
meaning we speak or we spoke. So as a little side note here, Guarani has a distinction between we, which includes the listener, and we, which excludes the listener. Guarani is agglutinative, meaning that rather than adding additional words to a sentence to show grammatical distinctions, multiple prefixes and suffixes can be added instead. Here's an example. This phrase means see you later.
Yayahuisha pebe.
The root is this verb,
Hisha.
meaning see. The subject is prefixed before the verb root.
Yahisha.
We see. Then another prefix is added between the subject prefix and verb root to show reciprocation.
Yayahuisha.
We see each other. Then an adverb meaning until is added after the verb.
Yayahuisha pebe.
Until we see each other. Or just see you later. Also nouns. They take suffixes to show number and case, but not gender.
Barakaya.
This means cat.
Barakaya cuera.
And this means cats.
Cuera.
Is an optional plural marker. When it comes after a nasal vowel, it becomes
Nguera. Mita.
This means child,
Mitanguera.
and this means children.
Mita ojehu barakayape.
The child loves the cat. Notice
Pe.
at the end of the word for cat. This is a suffix that indicates the accusative case for animate objects, and it can also show the locative case, like for a destination or location. Some other such suffixes are
Wi.
which indicates the ablative case, like from, and
Di.
or
Dive.
as a separate word, which indicates accompaniment, like with. Syntax. Notice the word order of this sentence, SVO. This is the most common word order in basic declarative sentences. But in reality, the word order is flexible, and it's fairly common for the subject to come after the verb and for objects to come before the verb. Notice that there's no definite article, no word meaning the. There's no native definite article in Guarani. But the Spanish definite articles, la and lo, are often used in daily conversation, though this would be considered yopara. Possession. What if we want to say, the child loves his cat, or her cat?
Mita ojehu barakayape.
E is a prefix that functions as a possessive adjective, this one being third person. The other possessive adjectives are separate words that aren't prefixed like this.
Derera.
This means your name,
Arera.
means name, specifically a given name, not a family name.
De.
Means you.
Baesha panderera.
What's your name?
Sherera Juan.
My name is Juan. When the possessor is an actual noun, it still comes before the thing that is possessed.
Shetua arera.
Means my father's name.
Shetua.
Means my father. And you already know that rera means name.
Shetua arera Jose.
This means my father's name is Jose. Verbs. Guarani verbs feature something called split intransitivity, or an active-stative split. Transitive verbs are active, while intransitive verbs can be either active or stative. The active verbs use active subject prefixes, which there are two different classes of, while the stative verbs use inactive subject pronoun prefixes. They're the same as the possessives that we saw earlier, and the same as the standalone subject pronouns, except for the third person. For example,
Awata.
I walk or I walked. This is active.
Shemandua.
I remember or I remembered. This is stative. Notice that in addition to the subject pronoun prefix that's attached to the verb, a standalone subject pronoun is optionally used.
Awata. Sheawata. Shemandua. Shemandua.
But normally only to emphasize or clarify. Stative verbs in Guarani are generally used for states, or things that happen that the person involved has no control over. And active verbs are generally used for intentional actions under the control of the subject. But in practice there are plenty of exceptions, so you really need to memorize which verbs are active versus stative. Grammatically speaking, there's really no distinction between stative verbs and adjectives or nouns, which can be used as a predicate by adding an inactive subject pronoun. Here's an example.
Sheposhi.
I'm angry. Literally, I anger. Here's another example.
Sheyawa.
I have a dog. Literally, I dog. This could also be expressed with an independent verb.
Aguareco yagua.
In this case, the verb is an active transitive verb. Tense and aspect. In Guarani, when verbs don't have any specific tense marking, they can be interpreted as either present tense or past tense, depending on the context. But there are also tense and aspect markers that can come after the verb. For the distant past, there's
Vaekue. Hae oikoa ekue Paraguaype.
This means he lived in Paraguay at some point in the past. For the future tense, there's the suffix ta.
Con eno estudiata.
I'm going to study tomorrow. Here
Estudia.
is actually a loanword from Spanish, which is incorporated into a Guarani grammatical structure. This kind of assimilation of Spanish loanwords is called.
Yehea.
The native Guarani word for study is
Yetaui o. Con eno ayetaui ota.
I'm going to study tomorrow. To make a negative future statement, ta is replaced by
Moa. Con eno tayetaui o moain.
I'm not going to study tomorrow. Negation itself is indicated by a circumfix, a combination of a prefix and a suffix that surround the verb. N plus e. There's also a postposition that shows progressive aspect,
Hina.
or after a nasal verb stem.
Ina. Anga ayetaui o hina.
This means I'm studying now. In literary Guarani,
Hina.
is actually a conjugated suffix that's different depending on person and number, but in everyday speech, it's widely used as a standalone aspect marker. There are also prefixes that can be added to verbs to indicate mood, like subjunctive and imperative, and there are other derivations like causation and desire, which are suffixed, and reflexive and reciprocal, which are prefixed. Take this imperative sentence.
Ehishokana sheve.
This means please show me. Word for word, it's imperative prefix for active verbs, see, causative, requestative imperative suffix, first person singular indirect object pronoun, in other words, me. The imperative here involves an imperative prefix e, while na is an extra suffix that softens a command or makes it more polite. This is called the requestative or the rogative.
Uka.
Is a causative suffix, so if you add it to the verb,
Hisha.
which means to see, then it means to show, like to make someone see. A moment ago, we saw that verbs can have a suffix that indicates past or future. In Guarani, nouns can too. For past tense, either
Kue. Nue.
or
Re.
are used, and for future tense,
Ra.
is used. For example,
Temireko.
means wife,
Temirekona.
means future wife or fiancé when referring to a woman,
Temireko kue.
means ex-wife. Sometimes both suffixes can be added. That may sound strange, like how can it be both past and future? But think about this example.
Temirekonangue.
This means former fiancé when referring to a woman. Notice that the suffix que becomes ngue because the preceding vowel is nasal. Another interesting feature of Guarani is its demonstratives, words like this, these, that, and those. In English, there are only two distinctions, near and far. In Guarani, demonstratives have several distinctions. Near, unmarked or middle distance. Far distance, absent or previously mentioned. Unseen but audible or previously mentioned.
Kota anga ipora.
This picture is beautiful. This is the demonstrative expressing that the picture is near the speaker. Then there's the word for picture.
Ta anga.
Then we have the adjective,
Pora.
which is made predicative by adding an inactive subject pronoun, in this case the third person.
Kuta anga ipora.
That picture is beautiful, referring to a picture that is not present when the people are talking about it. Earlier in the video, I spoke briefly about Jopa, but let's take another look at it. The degree to which people mix Guarani and Spanish depends on the person and the situation, and it can range from mostly Guarani with some Spanish elements to mostly Spanish with some Guarani elements. Older people and people in the countryside tend to use more traditional Guarani and less Jopa, while younger people and people in the cities tend to use more Jopa. Here's an example of what Jopa might look like.
Shendarekoi tanto conocimiento.
This means I don't have that much knowledge. Word for word, it's I, negative, I have, negative, that much, knowledge. Notice that the last two words are from Spanish. In traditional Guarani, this might be
Shendarekoi hetayekoa.
which translates to I don't have so much knowledge. In this sentence, all the words are of Guarani origin. Or a more natural way of saying it might be,
Shendarekoi heta.
which means I don't know so much. Word for word, it's I, negative, I know, negative, so, much. It's worth noting that many speakers and proponents of more traditional Guarani have a distaste for Jopa and see it as a degraded form of the language. But the majority of speakers speak some form of Jopa. Hopefully this video has given you an interesting glimpse at the Guarani language. Unfortunately, it's not an easy language to find learners' resources for. Duolingo has a Guarani course for Spanish speakers, but it's quite underdeveloped. I've found some other simple courses on Memrise, but they're very basic. I do have one good book about Guarani, but it's a grammar of the language rather than a textbook for learners. If you know of any other resources for learners, feel free to write them in the comments down below. And that brings me to the question of the day. For speakers of Guarani, particularly in Paraguay, to what extent do you mix Guarani and Spanish? Do you use one more than the other? Does it depend on the situation? And to other people, what's your impression of Guarani? Leave your comments down below. And now I'd like to say thanks to all the langfocus Patreon supporters who make it much easier to keep this channel going month after month. I want to especially thank the ones whose names appear on the screen because they are the top tier Patreon supporters. Many extra special thanks go out to them. And to everyone, thank you for watching and have a nice day.